So thank you for everybody to come to the privacy talk. I'm quite honored to invite Dr. Kris. So today we're gonna talk about the facial recognition AI and also the privacy related technology as well. So Kris, thank you for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to share his profile. Dr. Kris Shrishak is a technology fellow at Irish Council for Civil Liberties, ICCL, where he worked on technology policy with a focus on algorithmic decision-making. Previously, Kris was a researcher at TU Darmstadt, where he worked on applied cryptography, privacy enhancing technology paths, and internet infrastructure security. So again, appreciated to having a call this time. So I'd like to start today the agenda. And the first question is about your motivations. You have been working at this field in a technical and political perspective. So what is your motivation to work on a technology and a policy this time?
So, my PhD work, of course, was in a very technical field. During my PhD, I was thinking about the policy side of things, although I wasn't making any headway. And so after the end of the PhD, it made sense for me to actually try out working in the field of technology policy. Part of the reason being I felt having a lot more technology knowledge in the policy area is important. And that's something I could bring. And that's essentially the motivation to work in this field.
Thank you. I think there is a very layer to work in a technical and political area at this moment. So you work with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties right now. So what is your main role and the work at these organizations at this moment?
So my primary work at the Irish Council for Civil Liberties is in the area of artificial intelligence, and in particular, the regulation of artificial intelligence systems in the European Union. For context, the European Union or the European Commission has proposed a draft text on regulating artificial intelligence. So this was in April 2021. And the regulatory process essentially is about now the European Parliament and the European Council would then propose amendments to this text. And eventually they would find compromises and you would have a regulation. And so I'm essentially working to identify potential issues in the existing text and to help the regulators correct them before it becomes a regulation.
Thank you.
And, yeah, so I mean, just for context, as I come from a technical background, one of the approaches I use is to look at the regulation in a way that is there something that are mistakes from a technical point of view? So errors, mistakes, those are not necessarily political issues, so can be actually corrected much easily.
Thank you. I think that you had published the sum of the letters to the political decisions, the political announcement. There seems to be in Europe has many political amendment at this moment regarding to data related the policy draft. So you have been working on the enforcement, the AI regulation part. So maybe you have like the proposed to the commissions before about this letter. So is there any response from them? And if you give us any insights for these letters, so could you share about it?
Certainly. So I think the letter you're referring to is a letter from, I think, a couple of months ago, where myself and my colleague Johnny Ryan wrote to the European Commission about specific issues regarding ex post enforcement. So ex post is once an AI system is already deployed, how do you check and enforce the requirements that are set forth in the regulation? So in that regard, the primary role falls on an entity known as Market Surveillance Authority. This comes from essentially product safety regulation framework in the European Union, and the AI regulation is being regulated in that framework. And our main concern was that even at the level of the text, so even on paper, the enforcement is very weak, even weaker than GDPR. The issues with GDPR were more enforcing what is on paper in reality, and here, even on paper, it's very weak. So we have specific suggestions, and we followed up the letter with specific amendments, and some of them have been embraced by the European Parliament. The lead committees, which are known as the Internal Market Committee and the Civil Liberties Committees, they have taken up some of the amendments that we've presented to them. In particular, one of our concerns is that we might run into the issue that we don't have enforcement powers at the union level. So what that means is that current enforcement framework puts a lot of emphasis on the member states in the European Union. So think of Germany, Spain, Ireland, different countries. But there is no clear framework in the Commission's text which allows for resolving issues if the member states actually do not take actions. So that's one aspect. So we wanted to place a certain amount of emphasis on having union level enforcement as well. A second thing was that the current regulation does not give individuals like you and me to complain to the authorities, to the regulators, if something goes wrong. So that's another thing. So essentially giving rights, so right to complain to the individual if something goes wrong with the AI system, including cases where it's not about personal data. Because if it's only about personal data, we might be able to cover that in the GDPR. But if it's not about personal data and still the rights of individuals are affected, then we need those to be included here. A related thing is what is known as a right to judicial remedy. And that's another thing we propose. So both of these aspects about union level enforcement powers being given to either the Commission or another entity at the union level, providing right to complain and right to judicial remedy. So these have been included in the Parliament's draft currently. One aspect that I'm personally thinking about, but isn't currently being included anywhere, is the issue of reporting what is known as near misses. So there is a requirement in the regulation that if there is a serious incident that involves or actually is because of an AI system, then those need to be reported to the regulators by the essentially manufacturers. I think the term is providers here. But I'm concerned that that might be too late in some cases. We should have a mechanism so that near misses, so cases where something went wrong, but not a big harm was done. So if those are also reported, potentially anonymously by the providers, then there is a scope that we'll actually have a learning mechanism in place, and we can prevent larger serious incidents. This is not a new concept. We have similar concepts in aviation safety, for example, in railway safety, at least in Europe, we have these already there. So, but they were introduced much later, not when the first regulations were made. So I think we can. It's a good thing if we can actually include it in the first AI regulation rather than waiting for issues to pop up. Right. So we've already had enough issues with AI systems. So at least I think we should be considering including near misses in the first AI regulation as well.
Yeah, from the Japanese perspective, in Europe is quite advanced since you are trying to propose the AI regulations, but actually there is some of the points they need to improve to protect the consumer rights. I assume that's very important to notice for the consumers as well, to notice for the regulatory enforcement as well. So that's a very knowledgeable. Then thank you for sharing that information. So the next,
if I may quickly add one thing.
okay.
So you did mention consumer rights, and so in the European Union, I think you can have so you have consumer rights, but you can also have individual fundamental rights in addition. So the two things that I mentioned go into the second category. You can actually include certain aspects of consumer rights protection. So for instance, it's known as, I think, collective redress, if I'm not wrong, if that's the right term, wherein nonprofit organizations can essentially represent a group of consumers. So that's an additional thing that can be done. I'm not sure if that's been already included in the Parliament text or not, but that's also a proposal. For instance, the consumer rights organization, BUC, has been suggesting in Europe.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe the role of the consumer organization, the consumer rights should be inclusive to the political decisions. There seems to be a very closed the community where the policy decision is going up, but it's not just sometimes it's a democratic decision. So we need to be more inclusive of the voice of the consumers and the citizens to create a more democratic public regulation. That's supposed to be your message, is quite important. So to the next question is about the facial recognition AI in Europe. Since you proposed there's some requests through the letters, that is quite important. And also, I'm interested in the discussion about the facial recognition AI in Europe. So how this kind of the topics has been discussed among in Europe, and or what is currently the status of that?
Right. So from a regulatory standpoint, facial recognition will fall under what is known as biometric recognition. So because biometric can include other aspects, not only facial recognition. And in the Commission's proposal, so which was the first proposal, it was categorized as what is known as high risk. So a high risk case would be part of the regulation, but it's not prohibited. And there are some nuances. I'll leave that aside, but essentially that was the case. But there was a vote, I think, late last year in the European Parliament, which was a non-binding vote. So which means it doesn't become a law immediately, but it shows what the position taken by a majority of the ministers are. And there was an emphasis on actually banning facial recognition in the public domain. So if you think of it as the city squares or town squares, right? So facial recognition using CCTV cameras there, including CCTV cameras there would be, so those should be prohibited. That was at least a non-binding vote. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of the Parliament as well as the Council in Europe, because I think some of the ministers have voiced out repeatedly that they are not in favor of using facial recognition in the public. One particular aspect also is that the European Commission, for instance, makes a distinction between what is known as real-time and just remote biometrics. I would personally not make that distinction because there's so many ways to actually get around restrictions like that. So I would just think of it as biometric surveillance, or so that's one. That's from a regulatory standpoint. But there have also been cases in the past. So there are a couple of angles here when we think of facial recognition. The first is the database itself. So a database of facial images. Some of them essentially you might think of them not as images, but what is technically known as a template, because your face is essentially transformed into biometric templates. And you might have heard of cases such as the company Clearview AI, who have been selling their products, especially to law enforcement agencies. And that has raised a lot of red flags, including fines from multiple data protection authorities. If I remember correctly, the Italian authority issued a fine a few months back. The Australians and the Canadians have as well. In addition, I think some of them have also issued that Clearview AI should delete the images that are of the citizens of these countries. The challenge that I see there is how would they actually enforce it? We know that the data protection agencies have requested for these images to be deleted, but I haven't seen any evidence of if they have been deleted or anyone being able to check, right? So that's a challenge, and that also links up to the first thing that I mentioned about enforcement. Enforcement first needs to be good on paper, and then we need to figure out how to actually enforce things what's on paper. Yeah, so two angles there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the Clearview AI, I also had some research that there is many argument in other countries, in Canada and in Australia, in even the US has been a try to regulate it, their activity to sell in the data to the government or police, where has been a strong enforcement to the citizen that is very cautious to any misinformation, the misunderstanding of the algorithmic decision. So that's supposed to be needed to examine how it exactly how it works in the data processing. So as an understanding, thank you. So
I mean, the challenge there is this: a lot of the images in the database were not collected with consent of individuals, right? And that's the first step towards data collection, at least within the GDPR thing. You shouldn't be collecting private information of people without any consent. So that's like the first step. Everything else is later. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So to protect the consumer data, I suppose to be there needs many technical advancement. For example, there is some of the privacy enhancing the technology, such as the homomorphic encryptions, or some of the technology that Federated Learning is Google developing right now. So the next question about this privacy enhancing technology in the pets. So could you tell us about what is the privacy enhancing technology, and what is the interesting about this tech field?
Certainly. So privacy enhancing technology, or PETs in short, are essentially a number of different kinds of techniques. So different techniques provide different kinds of guarantees. So you did mention, for instance, homomorphic encryption. A related, essentially broad field is what is known as secure multi-party computation. So both of these are primarily interested in what is known as input privacy. So to give you an example, what this means is, let's say you have some information, some data that you feed into a computing environment, and you want to actually compute on something. Maybe you just want to feed in 10 individual salary, and you're interested in the average salary. But what you want to protect is each individual salary. So no one apart from the individual should know the salary amount, but at the end, everyone is interested in knowing the average amount, right? You can do something like that here. So you're protecting the individual privacy here, input privacy here. The second part is output privacy. So this is the case where you want to publish certain information, think of statistics, and you want to make sure no one is identifiable. And at a computational level, there's a technique known as differential privacy, which provides a fair amount of strong guarantees there. One example for that would be the US Census recently adopted differential privacy for this purpose. That's one. Yeah, so these are, let's say, two different angles. So one is input privacy, one is output privacy. So understanding what privacy guarantees you need would also imply. And of course, you can combine these techniques, right? So you can combine these techniques when you need both characteristics. Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting field. Also did a bunch of my research on that during my PhD. But yeah, so there's also elements, there are different issues involved. like homomorphic encryption or secure multi-party computation, there's a lot of thought now being put into how do we scale them, because they come with a lot of computational overhead. So yeah, so there are still challenges, but it's getting. And of course, the field itself did get a lift because of GDPR, I would say, that when there is a regulation that requires privacy, or in this case, data protection, a lot of these techniques turn out to be very beneficial, right? But understanding exactly what specific guarantees you get is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there is some of the technical solution. Even it's a R&D phase, research and development right now, but probably there is some of the demands to use this privacy text. So is there any field you are expecting to use the privacy enhancing technology, even it takes so many times? There is the big market in next decades. You have any ideas for that?
I think it is getting picked up. I can't immediately come up with specific names, but for instance, I think there are companies which are developing specific kinds of secure multi-party computation protocols, in particular what is known as threshold signatures, that is being considered in for blockchains, for example, for the signing. And I mean, I've worked in the past on that as well. So that's one example. But there are other cases, such as if one might think of images from multiple institutions, any kind of images or information from multiple institutions, you might want to pour in and actually identify patterns, for example, right? So for instance, machine learning, wherein you can learn from different hospitals, for example. You want to learn patterns to understand what's happening, but you don't actually want to get the individual information from the hospitals, because that's private information, not only of the hospital, but of the patients, right? So those kind of scenarios are the places where you might think of where it will be very useful. But there's just a couple that come to mind, but there are definitely multiple benefits there and potential uses.
Thank you. Yeah, I also expected this kind of the technology will be integrated in a very natural processing the personal data that could be the more protected our data, not just release our own identifiable data to the unknown party. That is a very significant choice for us. So yeah, that's a very informative. Then, so thank you for the taking the interview. So lastly, I'd like to ask about any message for listeners, because I think the facial recognition AI and privacy tech is very important field. A lot of the listeners should know what it happens, what they should do that. So could you give us any message for that?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. One is when using privacy enhancing technology, make sure you understand what privacy guarantees you get from specific techniques. So don't just buy whatever you see on the market. From a regulatory standpoint, of course, the EU's regulation of AI systems is essentially the first. And so one might expect that other countries would potentially rely on the text, or at least maybe even copy to an extent what's going to happen. So yeah, so just keeping an eye out on what's going on in the EU in general is also a good thing. Regarding facial recognition, there are multiple angles there. So we spoke about CCTVs, for example. One thing I always like to emphasize is it's not only about the possibility of facial recognition on the CCTV, but you can also do facial recognition once these images are captured on servers, on computers. So that's an important point to keep in mind, because you might have companies that might sell you CCTV saying, oh, this doesn't have facial recognition, although you can run the facial recognition once you capture the image and store it on servers, for example. So yeah.
Thank you.
Those three would be the important ones, I'd say.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very kind reading message for the listeners to understand what the point is need to understand of that. So thank you for sharing. And also it's very appreciated to have a great time with Dr. Kris, and it's a very knowledgeable and very well experienced in this field. I think it's very ambiguous, technology and politics, but your work is very exclusive to push the more democratic voice to the political decisions. It's a very cheerful and happy to support somehow to work on this space. So thank you for having this time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.